Strange Studies of Strange Stories.
I want to tell you about a very odd experience I had a few months ago. Not so as to entertain you, but because I think it raises some very basic questions about, what life is all about and to what extent we run our own lives. Rather worrying questions. Anyway, what happened was this.
What happened? What was this? What's happening?
Calm down, man. It's okay. You are Chris Lackey, and I'm your pal, Chad Pfeiffer.
Yeah.
And this is Strange Studies of Strange Stories. And guess what? Your friend Jamie Brittain is here too.
That's right, little buddy.
Oh my God. Now I'm freaked out with joy.
We are so grateful to have Jamie back once again as a guest on the show and as a guest TJ. That stands for Tome Jockey. Just came up with it. Jamie, what is the story you've brought us, the beginning of which has frightened Chris Lackey so?
I have brought a story by Kingsley Amis called Who or What Was It?
This is a writer we have not covered before. I'm excited to learn all about him. I do have to admit that Kingsley Amis sounds like a name I'd make up for like a rich snob character. Hello, I'm Nigel Featherbottom, and this is my companion in looking down at people, Kingsley Amis. Do please put down that goblet of liquid gold you're drinking, Kingsley. We actually have done a story before called What Was It by Fitz James O'Brien about 13 spooky years ago. So this title was a little familiar and yet not quite the same, just like the events in the story.
You guys ever seen that meme, which is a Spotify playlist called Marvin Gaye's Clueless Ass? And all the titles are, what's going on? What's happening, brother? Where are we going? I think all short stories with titles like this should be collected into an anthology of clueless writers. Who goes there, etc.
I agree.
That reader, however, was very familiar. Who was that?
Why? That was none other than Marsh Davies, RPG designer extraordinaire, fellow podcaster with my good self on the Crate and Crowbar, an all-round solid egg boy. You can buy his fabulous RPG book Teeth or back Gold Teeth, his piratey new one. Links are in the show notes.
Excellent. Well, we will also, of course, link out to the Crate and Crowbar podcast, which covers PC video games. Is that right?
Just video games these days. We try not to be too narrow.
All right. Well, thank you, Marsh, for reading. Go check out the show. And we will also link out to an audio recording of this story, Who or What Was It, read by the author himself, Kingsley Amis. The story is actually originally was the script for that broadcast. More on that in a moment. Jamie, you have a particular expertise with this author, right?
Yeah, I first encountered him when I was a teenager. I read Lucky Jim, which is his first novel, and then his memoirs, which are actually a collection of essays where he just slags off a bunch of other writers, and then his letters, which were mostly between him and Philip Larkin.
All right.
What I loved about him, I think, is I really responded to the lack of distinction he made between high and low culture, how he despised snobbery and pretense, and how good he was at pointing out things that were ridiculous and pretentious, I guess. Imagine a guy born in 1922 who calls The Terminator a flawless masterpiece, which he did.
Oh, wow. I mean, I guess he's definitely not somebody who'd be drinking a goblet of liquid gold then.
Yeah, no.
He eventually did become a provocative old racist dinosaur and right-wing troll, much to the annoyance of his children and family.
Yeah.
And I think the booze that was a large part of his life was a big part of that. But he does have this wonderful sense of humour that persists right from the beginning of his career right to the very end, when he would show up on television and make everyone fall about laughing.
Kingsley Amis is new to me, so who is this guy?
Well, I'm glad you asked. He was born in 1922 to middle-class parents in Clapham. Oxford in the 1940s, he befriended Philip Larkin, for my money, the greatest British poet of the 20th century, and the two bonded over a shared love of traditional jazz and writing each other extraordinarily scatological letters, which have to be seen to be believed, and also slagging off J.R.R. Tolkien, who was the mumbling old English professor who'd write the important words on the board in a legible script and then stand in front of them. Everyone hated him. And their friendship between Amis and Larkin stretched across their entire lives, which you can learn all about in the movie When Amis Met Larkin. Or at least you could have done had the BBC decided to actually make the thing after I wrote the script.
Aww.
Jude Law was going to play Philip Larkin.
Wow.
Probably.
What?
I mean, he said he would at a party once, but
Sure.
I take that man at his word.
Oh, man. I have to say, before I read any biography on Amis or actually understood that the character in this story was literally him, I just read it cold, as if I'd found it in an anthology. And it worked great all on its own. You didn't need all of this backstory. But I have learned some biography on Mr. Amis, so let me pick up the thread here. In the late 1950s, Amis published his first novel, Lucky Jim, which became an iconic book of the era, cementing his reputation as one of the angry young men. and that was a group of working-class writers that were dubbed that by the press. This group included John Osborne, whom I've heard of before because he wrote the play Look Back in Anger, which is quite famous. Over the next 40 years, Kingsley Amis largely penned a series of comic novels, but also wrote extensively on his passions, jazz, women, drink, as well as genre fiction, including Colonel's Son, which many consider to be the best Bond novel not written by Fleming. In fact, it was the first Bond continuation novel written after Fleming's death. Amis did write that one under a pseudonym.
Yeah, he was, as I mentioned earlier, kind of high and low culture, being indistinct from each other it was one of his main passions, and that also stretched to his kind of defense of science fiction. So there's this great book you can get called New Maps of Hell, which is these lectures he gave in the late 1950s. And he really was one of the first people from a literary background to sort of distinguish between good and bad science fiction, whilst also being really clear that he wasn't doing a whole, my goodness, isn't this simply fascinating? You know, he's a genuine fan of it and gives it, in those essays, a really good working over. He mentions Lovecraft in one of them, I should say. He described him as having a memorable nastiness, offering that Lovecraft's intrinsic importance is small, but he does give the impression of being much more than ripe for psychoanalysis, which pervades much fantasy and early science fiction. And the difficulty of categorizing some of his work faithfully reflects the confusion of a period when non-realistic writing was in the throes of eternal fission.
Much more than ripe is an excellently Lovecraftian turn of phrase.
Amis was initially married to Hilly Bardwell, with whom he had 3 children, Philip, named after a Larkin, Sally, and Martin, who would go on into the family business and become a writer himself. Amis was a serial philanderer and boozer, and ultimately his marriage with Hilly broke down. He then took up with Elizabeth Jane Howard, the serial dater of writers, having had affairs with Laurie Lee, Cecil Day Lewis, Cyril Connolly, and Robert Aikman?
Yeah, well, we talked about that before when we covered his biography, and that's how I knew her name, because of Aikman. But in this story, when the protagonist mentioned Jane, I actually thought of her immediately, even though I did not know it was the same person, and I did not know there was any Aikman affiliation. I don't know why my mind went there, but it was kind of odd considering the content of the story that it did.
Yeah.
This story itself is an Aikman-esque tale in which the writer and Elizabeth Jane Howard is a character in the story.
Yep.
She was easy to write off as a kind of serial muse of writers, I think, because she had so many affairs with so many very famous men. But actually, she was a completely brilliant writer herself, writing wonderfully rich and textured kind of high society novels. The Long View is considered kind of her first great novel, the premise of which is something like, what if Memento was the story of a miserable marriage over several decades? So it kind of works backwards.
Oh, wow. I can see it.
It's very good. I think her later work is like a huge epic about one family that covers multiple books and was written over multiple decades. I'm sure it's extraordinary. I think it says something about the literary establishment, even now, that there's this amazing one-volume biography of Amis by Zachary Leader, which was my main source for the movie I wrote, and it lists all of her lovers except for Aikman. That's the one he leaves out, even though that was the affair that she would write the memoir about. Apparently Weird Canal Guy doesn't get a look in. But the comparisons between the story we're covering today and Aikman's work, ambiguity, weird sex stuff, a creepy hotel, all the Aikman hits, they couldn't have been lost on her. I'm sure she would have noticed.
At the end of his life, Amis did split with Elizabeth Jane Howard and moved back in with Hilly. He died October 1995, age 73. It seems that his alcoholism finally caught up with him.
His son, Martin Amis, is probably more famous these days, writing books like Money and The Zone of Interest, and who also died a couple of years ago.
Now on to today's story. Who or what was it? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so the story was originally a radio play, and we have the link to that in the show notes. And it was a sort of piece of kind of metafiction inspired by the novel The Green Man, which was published a couple of years before the radio play in 1969. The Green Man is really worth a read. It's a really kind of beguiling mix of Amis's standard kind of comedy of manners, social topsy-turvy, mixed with like pretty full-throated folk horror. I also really recommend the BBC TV version from the 90s, which is also excellent. Albert Finney playing kind of Amis, the Amis stand-in character, and I'm pretty sure he's actually doing an impression of Amis, who had kind of pretty well-known personality. Although I only know Albert Finney is like Daddy Warbucks from Annie, so who knows. But in the tradition of BBC Ghost Stories, the protagonist's father is played by the guy from the 1960s adaptation of Whistle and I'll Come to You, which was a previous episode you guys did, and kind of Christmassy horror classic.
Yeah, I remember covering that. The Green Man is in 3 parts on YouTube if you'd like to watch it. We've linked out. I watched the first hour last night, which is just the first part, and I'm definitely going to finish all 3 of them. I was surprised by 2 things. Number one being the sheer amount of scotch the main character was drinking throughout. It was making me feel ill. I watched this because you'd sent the link, but I hadn't read anything about the author yet. I did think as I was watching it, the guy who wrote this was clearly somebody with a drinking problem because it was presented very honestly, I thought. The way that he was going from room to room and he had scotch in every place so that nobody could see how much he was actually drinking. Wow. The other thing that surprised me was that it was legitimately scary. I didn't know what to expect at all, but as I turned it on, the vibe was very 1990 BBC, video, television, so it might have lulled me into some kind of vanilla TV expectations. But then right away, some Evil Dead stuff happened, and I was kind of shocked by it.
Yeah, it's in the grand tradition of the BBC showing some of the most bleak shit known to man at Christmas. Another tradition of the BBC, of course, is not producing scripts that they've already paid for with A-list Hollywood talent attached. Hashtag just saying.
As you said, this story was a takeoff of that novel. And this story was first published in written form in the December 1972 issue of Playboy magazine. I read it in collected short stories from 1980.
Let's get into the story itself. Who or what was it? As we heard at the top, we have the author as the actual protagonist of the story. It's being told to us as if it actually happened. And it's suggested that the story raises some rather worrying questions, which I thought was quite an understatement after I read the whole thing.
The author, Kingsley Amis, and his wife, Elizabeth Jane Howard, are coming home from a trip up north near the Lake District. It's a long drive back, so they decide to stop at a place they found in a travel guide.
Kingsley doesn't want to name this place for reasons that will become obvious later in the story. When they get to the place, they go to the bar and order a table, which will be ready in half an hour, but Kingsley overhears someone say that Mr. Allington is off for the evening. This prompts him to think, and then he asks a young staff member if his name is David Palmer. The guy says, "No, I'm George Palmer." Kingsley then goes to the barman and asks if his name is Fred Soames, but the guy says, "No, I'm Fred Browning." He quietly ponders their responses and returns to Jane.
She asks him, what was that all about? And as a reader, I was wondering the same. What just happened? And then Amis explains that those men all had similar names to the characters in his novel, The Green Man, which, as we said, came out a couple of years before this. It was a take on folk horror mixed with his literary style. The landlord in that book was called Allington, and his deputy was called David Palmer, and the barman was named Fred Soames. So as he says, it's a thumping great coincidence, staggering in fact. Also, the novel had in it this monster, which is the Green Man, that menaces a pub, not unlike the one that they're in right now in this story. He describes it as a sort of solid ghost conjured up out of tree branches and leaves, and so on, that very nearly kills Allington and his young daughter. In the book, the pub owner, Mr. Allington, successfully protects his daughter from the Green Man. Now, Amis is a little worried that Jane will think he's being crazy, but she doesn't. She goes along with it and suggests that maybe he's been to another pub years ago. That's where he maybe got the name because of Mr. Allington worked there, and maybe the same Mr. Allington has now moved on to this pub. So the name just popped up in his subconscious when he was writing, which is exactly what I would have said trying to explain what happened here.
Do you reckon Jane didn't think he was crazy because she's like, listen, I used to date this canal guy and he used to talk some weird shit, so this is nothing compared to that.
Confirmed. Kingsley sees the logic in this line of thought, but he's not convinced. Jane and Kingsley have their meal, and Kingsley has a few drinks. Amis decides to invite Palmer to join him and his wife for a drink after the meal, and Palmer accepts. And I wondered if Palmer was thinking there was going to be some kind of hookup situation going on. But it's not a hookup situation. No. Kingsley uses this time to question Palmer about the details of this place. And he's up front. He says, I wrote a book called The Green Man, and there are some strange similarities to this place in that book.
Yes, and your consideration of maybe it was a hookup is not misplaced when you look at The Green Man, which is full of that stuff.
Oh.
Absolutely. Another thing, actually I should say there was a third thing that surprised me about that first hour that I watched, which was the casual suggestion that let's have a threesome.
Wow.
Yep.
Yeah, you're going to want to watch this.
I got to see it now.
As they talk to Palmer, he discovers that the details don't quite align. Mr. Allington's wife is dead in real life, but not in the story. There is no history of hauntings, the pub is much newer than the pub in the story, but Mr. Allington does have a teenage daughter named Marilyn, was Amy in the book, and Palmer looks just like the character he envisioned when he wrote the book. There were not many hits, but it was still unsettling to Kingsley. And also, there are things he can't ask him due to kind of social rules.
For instance, was Allington a boozer like my Allington? And even more so, had this Allington had a visit from God? In the book, God turns up in the form of a young man to give Allington some tips on how to deal with the ghosts, who he, God, thinks are a menace to him. No point going any further into that part.
That sequence is the best bit of the book and the TV adaptation, not least because it features God interrupting a threesome. So the threesome happens, by the way.
Oh,
it's stopped early because
that was
God,
a positive spoiler.
Absolutely,
Wow.
because God turns up to stop time and then appear as a white-suited, wet-lipped young toff who delivers Allington some very straightforward advice about the nature of existence, etc. He's portrayed as a sort of moderately bored bureaucrat, aware of how passé it is for him to be showing up and literally handing the lead character a deus ex machina.
Wow.
Can't wait for that scene. Now, you included some of his dialogue in the notes, and I found it really funny and a little Lovecraftian as well. So I'll just quote some of it. God says, "I think I took some fairly disputable decisions right at the start, not having foreknowledge. Honestly, this foreknowledge business is too absurd. As if I could carry on at all if I had that. Well, then I was stuck with those decisions and their results in practice. Not an easy situation, you know. I just realized that I was there, or here, or wherever you please, and on my own and with these powers. I must say, I wonder how you'd have managed." He sounded slightly cross. "You can't imagine what it's like to be faced with a set of choices that are irrevocable and also unique." That's some good God dialogue. And a fairly believable explanation for the whole thing. He just showed up and thought, well, I'm lonely. I got to make some quick decisions. And then went, man, maybe some of those weren't so good. But nothing I can do about it now.
Now, I just want to point out that is from the book The Green Man, not from this story.
That's correct. Yeah, that's when God showed up in the threesome in The Green Man. That scene does not happen here. In fact, why don't I get back to the story? Yeah. Palmer says his goodbyes after answering all of their questions about the similarities between the novel and the actual place, and Jane and Kingsley talk. Kingsley is impressed that Jane isn't dismissing this out of hand, but she says, well, if this is something, what is it? And he thinks about it for a second, and he thinks, well, it might be maybe we've wandered into some parallel dimension. She thinks about this idea for a minute and then goes, okay, wait a minute, gets that day's paper. And then Jane says, you read this morning, right? So if we've crossed over into a world where there are differences, then there will likely be some differences in the paper in this dimension. Give it a look. Kingsley scans the paper, and he doesn't find anything out of place.
It's a very Amisian kind of thing to actually genuinely think through the situation that's impossible rather than just accepting it out of hand.
Kingsley then remembers that it's August, and Mr. Allington is due to return that evening, which was the exact setup in his book for the attack of the Green Man. He also admits to the reader that when he writes, all of his characters have an aspect of himself in them, some more than others, but Mr. Allington had a lot of Kingsley in him.
Of all his protagonists, Allington is maybe the most like Amis, particularly in how vivid he portrays the alcoholism.
Yeah.
And that gets him to thinking, I'm actually more like the fictional Allington than the real guy. And if whatever is happening, if the story is happening in the real world, then I would be the most likely stand-in. I would be the person that would have to face the Green Man if he came. And this is Kingsley's line of thought here.
Right. I'm more Allington than Allington, so I'm going to be the one that's going to have to stop this monster. And Jane isn't shocked by this. In fact, she feels like, well, if this is the case, we should play this thing out. It's better to be prepared if it's nothing than be not prepared if it is real. Kingsley thinks that just because things are playing out like the story, that doesn't mean that he shouldn't try to get some help. So he tries to call his buddy, Bob Conquest. I thought, well, all right, this is supposed to be all real, but he definitely doesn't know anybody named Bob Conquest.
100% a real guy with a real name.
Oh, my goodness.
So Robert Conquest was a pretty well-renowned historian, poet and novelist, and a longtime friend of Amis, the him and Larkin, kind of the sort of threesome. He wrote one of the first books about the Stalinist purges of the 1930s, which was called The Great Terror, and that was published in 1968. And it kind of arrived at a time when people weren't really vibing with the idea of communism, in Russia being absolutely bad. And it was kind of dismissed. And then later on, when much of it was proven to be true, Amis used to joke, if there was ever a new edition of the book, he could call it, I Told You So, You F***ing Fools. And that's why in the story, Kingsley thinks if anyone would be on board for this nuttiness, it would be Bob, because he's famously able to think outside the box. But he can't get hold of him. They
try to get a hold of Jane's brother, who is named Monkey. I'll assume that's also true. But Monkey is out at a party, which is where I assume Monkey would be. They decide it's up to them, and so they book a room at the pub to try and deal with this themselves. They wait until the bar closes, and then Kingsley, his plan is to sneak out and be in the place where he knows the events of the novel happen. He checks in with Jane to make sure she's okay with this, and she is, because, she believes in ghosts. and she thinks this is reasonable to check this thing out. Sure. Kingsley says that he's always been an anxious kind of person, but in this moment, he feels really confident and calm, ready to face whatever is in front of him.
One problem that comes up is that in the book, the protagonist uses a magic item to defeat the Green Man, and they don't have anything like that. Jane suggests giving him her plain gold cross pendant. She is sure that it's going to work. I would not be sure. That sounds nutty to me. But with this newfound confidence, Kingsley's saying, yeah, this is going to work. I'm ready for it. Around midnight, Kingsley sees a man arrive, the real Mr. Allington, and that was the time that he arrived in the book.
After Allington gets into the pub and settles in, it gets quiet. Believing that the Green Man is going to show up soon, he tells Jane to watch out the window as he goes out and explores and does some creeping and peeping. He has a little trouble getting out, but manages to find a door with a key in it. He goes out, looks around, and then sees Jane looking down from the window, and they give each other a little wave. Kingsley is out there, looking around, trying to figure out where the Green Man would come from, but then he sees a girl. It's Marilyn, Allington's daughter. She's just standing there in her green pyjamas, apparently sleepwalking and unresponsive. This is all stuff that happens in The Green Man. Just then, he hears the sound of something coming through the woods, something that sounds just like the description of the sounds of The Green Man.
So I just stayed close to the girl and went on keeping watch. And a bit more time went by, and then, sure enough, I heard, faintly but clearly, the sound I'd written about, the rustling, creaking sound of the movement of something made of tree branches, twigs, and clusters of leaves. And there it was, about 100 yards away, not really much like a man, coming up at a clumsy, jolting sort of jog trot on the grass verge, and accelerating. I knew what I had to do. I started walking to meet it with the cross ready in my hand. The girl hadn't moved at all. When the thing was about 20 yards away, I saw its face, which had fungus on it, and I heard another sound I'd written about coming from what I suppose you'd have to call its mouth, like the howling of wind through trees.
He sort of blasts through it in this version, but the Green Man is very scary in the book and in the TV show.
That's the Evil Dead aspect I was talking about.
Right.
Yeah,
Scary tree attack.
Yep, 90s BBC special effects department weren't messing around.
No, they were not.
There's also a bit where he's terrorised by a really fake-looking bat while he's in the bath.
Oh.
Less scary.
Yeah.
Well, sir, you have now assured that I will finish watching this movie. But, Marsh, why don't you take us back to the confrontation with the Green Man in this story?
I stopped and steadied myself, and threw the cross at it, and it immediately vanished. Immediately. That wasn't like the book, but I didn't stop to think about it. I didn't stop to look for the cross either. When I turned back, the girl had gone. So much the better. I rushed back into the inn and up to the bedroom and knocked on the door. I told Jane to lock it after me.
So a little anticlimactic, he just threw the cross and the thing disappeared when it hit him, almost like something you do in a side-scroller video game.
Oh, please, you're just so Castlevania-pilled, Chad.
Well, Jane looks very confused at Kingsley arriving in the room as he's telling her about everything that happened. He says, I saw the girl, I saw the Green Man, I threw the cross, it disappeared. He gives her the whole summary of what's happened. And then she says, I don't know what you're talking about. That is not what just happened. She says, you, Kingsley, came back to the room not long after you'd left and said that this was all foolish. You gave me the gold cross back, which she shows to him to prove that he gave it back to her. Mm-hmm. And then you got into bed with me. And this causes him to break down a little bit because what she's describing is not what he feels that he did. He thinks, am I crazy? Did all of this really happen? And he thinks, well, of course it happened. I know it happened. I went down there and I did it, but what does it all mean? And he's so upset, Jane has to give him sleeping pills, and they kind of put the discussion to the side for the time being.
So the next morning, Kingsley wakes up feeling awful. Jane says that, well, he slept in, she went around and talked to people, and found out that Allington's daughter is a known sleepwalker, and that her pyjamas matched his description. This calms him in a way. He's not crazy. But what does it mean? What happened? They both decide not to go and look for the cross he threw, kind of out of fear of what it would mean either way, if it's there, if it's not.
Right. And so there is proof for both stories. She's got the cross to defend her side of the story, and then his description of the pajamas was correct. So it sounds like his events happened as well.
As they drive home, Jane asks him what he thinks all this means. He suggests that he may have been divinely inspired to write the book, to prepare him to deal with what was fated to happen. And Jane says that if something that was powerful enough to do that, a god or some presence that could inspire you to write a whole novel and then years later it plays out, shouldn't that entity be able to just stop the Green Man by itself? Kingsley suggests maybe there are rules that they have to follow, or maybe it was just more fun for the divine presence to do it this way. More fun, Jane repeated. She looked very thoughtful. And then we end with this.
As you'll have seen, there was one loose end of the sort. Who or what was it that had taken on my shape to enter that bedroom, talk to Jane with my voice, and share her bed for at any rate a few minutes? She and I didn't discuss it for several days. Then one morning she asked me the question, more or less as I've just put it. Interesting point, I said. I don't know. It's more interesting than you think, she said, because when whoever it was got into bed with me, he didn't just go to sleep. I suppose I just looked at her. That's right, she said. I thought I'd better go and see John before I told you. That's John Allison, our GP. It was negative then, I said. Yes, Jane said. Well, that's it. A relief, of course, but in one way, rather disappointing.
Whoa.
What?
So that's the end of the story. Quite a twist.
Uh-huh.
She slept with this doppelganger, but wasn't pregnant. In what way was that disappointing?
Maybe if she was pregnant, then there would be more to the story. You know, that was just the beginning, and so she would have like a child, and maybe the child's his, maybe it's not, maybe it's the demon child. You know, who knows? Mm-hmm. But she's not pregnant, so story's over, I guess.
That was a really unsettling story, and uncanny in the sense that a realistic doll is uncanny. It's familiar enough to stir expectations in our minds that it's going to move, but we know it's unreal. Mm-hmm. And I feel like the story managed to do that same thing, but in a really creative way by having real life incidents, ape incidences in a novel by the author, but not really.
And there's a lovely way in which it's written, because it is kind of written in this kind of conversational style with like little dead ends and like backing ups that you hear in kind of when you're telling someone a story or telling someone an anecdote. And you can hear him, you know, in the radio play version, you can hear him do this. In the penultimate line of the story, we get like, go and see John, and then he clarifies that's John, our GP. It's like, most writers wouldn't make that decision, but it gives it just that little edge of something different. In the introduction to the collection of short stories that this story's in, he talks about the origins of the story as a radio play, and that it was a kind of attempt of his to recreate the vibes of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. And like a lot of little bits of Amis writing, the introduction is very entertaining, as he talks with quite a lot of relish about quite a few people, including his friends, who were fooled by the story and thought it was real.
He set out to do this and then was kind of disappointed in the results. I loved reading his account of it. He says, my intention had been to fool listeners into thinking it was a factual account until 3/4 of the way through, and then with luck, induce them to suspend their altogether necessary disbelief for the last few minutes. So they would realize it was becoming a story and that it wasn't a real occurrence when the cross comes into action and the Castlevania moment, as we like to call it. But then he says, for some, it missed its mark most grievously. And he's so surprised. Despite that obvious throwing the cross absurdity in the ending, people were still calling to talk about what had happened.
Oh, wow.
Nobody, as far as I know, panicked or drove to Cornwall as a result of my broadcast. He says, but he concludes, those who said they thought the story was true or might be true responded illogically and inappropriately. Those reactions to my broadcast constitute one more small piece of evidence that, when it comes to any debatable question of this sort, from the existence of ghosts to the value of palmistry, the line between belief and disbelief is becoming blurred. Is astrology true or false? Many would say that there was something in it, many more than take the slightest practical notice of its advice. Do you believe the flat earth theory? Yes and no. That way madness lies. I loved that. He was really upset that some people fell for it.
Yeah.
That's all talking about the presentation of the story. What do you think about the story itself, Jamie?
I may just pull up a soapbox here, because obviously I've been obsessed with Kingsley Amis for a long time. But
Sure.
I do think there's a really interesting subtext under this story. I think that kind of near miss acknowledged in the final lines, like the fact that he says it's disappointing that she's not pregnant with a weird Christ child or whatever. Mm-hmm. There is something dark beneath it, I think. So one thing that surprised me when I first read this story, and I first read it when I was looking for Amis stories to bring to you guys, and I sort of weird fiction Amis stuck that into Google. The literary device of having yourself as a character in a novel or being a kind of metafiction is the sort of thing that Amis was often really dismissive of. I think the story is that he rang up Martin Amis and shouted at him when he got to the bit in Money where Martin himself appears as a character. So I was kind of thinking, what's the justification for this? Why is he doing this? To kind of pull back a little bit, Amis's work has this kind of sensitivity that was never particularly evident in his life or the way he treated people. And he was able to process in fiction in ways he never could in life. Quite a lot of alcoholic writers before and since, right? They often have that kind of level of poetry and self-knowledge that their family members would be desperate for them to have in reality.
Yes.
And the portrait of alcoholism, as we mentioned earlier in The Green Man, is really visceral and honest and like lacerating and portrayed in a way that is just really speaks to you if you've ever had any experience of this stuff. Even though Amis only gestured to those similarities. But according to Jane Howard, in 1969, when he was writing The Green Man, he was, quote, often drinking the equivalent of a bottle of whiskey a day, and he often suffered from jactitation and something like hallucinations, in addition to having what Robert Conquest, here he is again, described to Philip Larkin as an increasingly common experience of not remembering how he got home. And Jane reports that several times he was unable to distinguish between real and imagined happenings, and at one point argued with her for a whole day about the guest list of a previous evening's dinner party, an event which had never taken place at all.
Whoa.
And that is, in fact, the incident which inspired this whole story, as Jane Howard told Amis's biographer. This argument that they had. So my feeling with the kind of fictional caprice of the story is Amis is actually aligning himself more with Allington in The Green Man, rather than trying to distance himself from him. This idea of acts committed outside one's control or like by a doppelganger or under the kind of purview of a dark god, I think is about the sort of schism that an alcoholic feels. One moment, like Amis, you can be sane, brilliant, beloved, famous, sexually powerful in the way he was, able to write through a whole bunch of booze, and then after a certain point, after rather a lot to drink, as he says in this story, you can become, something entirely different. And so for me, that the disappointment that the test was negative, it makes me think about that kind of drunken megalomania of writers and drunk people in general, that you actually feel that your excess has some power in it, something kind of transcendental, that you're sort of reaching towards something bigger than you, even though that is just the lie of the drug, right, that has its hold on you, that you can sort of drink yourself through to the other side.
Wow. We actually touched on that in our extra credit episode a couple of months ago. We covered the movie The Substance. And while that was about younger actress replacing an older actress, there was also an aspect of addiction to it where she was literally very angry at what the other her had done. When you black out from alcohol abuse, your mind stitches together events that are not quite what they actually were. You can't recall what actually happened. And so you are left with two realities often that will only come up when somebody presents you with the other side of it. Without it being presented to him, what he thought happened would have gone into his memory as what happened, and it's really interesting the way that this all came about. At the same time, I didn't necessarily read it that way when I read it. I just read it as a weird tale, and it worked excellently that way.
Oh, yeah. It's an outstanding story. I really, really enjoyed it, and his writing style it's effortless to read.
Thank you, Jamie, for bringing the story to our attention and for coming on and bringing us all this knowledge.
Yeah.
No problem. It's one of the two things I know about Kingsley Amis and the characters of the PlayStation video game Tekken 2. So have me on again and I'll talk through some Tekken lore.
Wow.
That sounds like a date.
The strangest study of all.
I also want to thank our lovely reader, Marsh Davies.
Thanks to Marsh Davies. Buy his brilliant RPG with Jim Ross and Newell Teeth, or back his even newer upcoming piratey-themed RPG, Gold Teeth. Listen to his podcast that I do with him sometimes called Crate and Crowbar.
We will link out to all of that in the show notes, and of course we want to thank some of our patrons who make this show possible. I'm going to start by thanking Matthew Alderman.
I'd like to thank Jester Bowl.
Carrie Ann Muckle, thank you.
Jason Tick, thank you.
Dylan Landrum, thank you so much.
Archie, thanks.
Chris Softly, thank you.
Matt Sanchez, thank you.
John Lucas, thank you so much.
And I want to thank Christopher.
And of course, these free shows would not be possible without our stakers. Thank you so much. You are the executive producers that get these things done. I'm going to thank you real quickly. Thank you, Bag of Weasels, the King of All the Snakes, Jay Robinson, Alistair Brooks, Shmail Khan, Christopher Rosshair, Jared Brown, It's a Ghost, John Morgan, Angelina Brown, Eric S. Vallone, MD, Richard Wolf, and Ben A.
Woo!
You guys are the best. We're going to be back with more strange stories for you in the future. For now, I am Chad Pfeiffer.
I'm Chris Lackey.
I'm Jamie Brittain
And you've been listening to Strange Studies of Strange Stories.
at strangestudies.com.
Strange Studies of Strange Stories.